Okay, so you send over some pretty interesting excerpts from a U.S. Army field manual.
Uh-huh.
This FM10021.pdf. It's on Soviet military doctrine.
Right.
Looks like you're trying to get a handle on, Cold War strategy, how they thought.
Yeah, yeah. Always a good idea to know how the other side thinks, during that period.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a lot of material here.
Yeah.
We're dealing with everything from, offense and defense, like their broad strategies, to battlefield tactics,
Yeah.
how they structured their command, how they thought about firepower, the role of electronic warfare, even some stuff on like nuclear and chemical weapons.
Yeah, a real deep dive.
It is a deep dive. That's why we're here.
Oh, that's right.
So why don't we just jump right in?
Yeah, let's do it.
What really jumps out at you when you look at, Soviet military doctrine?
Well, right off the bat, the thing that I find most fascinating is how they view war itself. Unlike the West, where we generally see war as a failure of diplomacy.
Right, right.
The Soviets, they framed it as this inevitable clash between socialism and capitalism.
So they saw it almost as like a natural outcome of the political struggle.
Almost like an extension of the political struggle, yeah.
Okay, so they were basically like always in war mode, even when things were, quote, peaceful.
Exactly. This constant state of ideological conflict.
Got it.
It was like woven into their military doctrine,
Yeah.
influencing everything from how they trained to how they allocated resources.
Okay, so how did that mindset, this always at war mindset, how did that actually play out in their like strategic approach?
So they had this this unique concept that they called the correlation of forces.
Okay.
It went beyond just comparing like military strength,
Right.
They were constantly trying to assess the balance of power across like all these different domains. Political, moral, economic, and of course military.
So it was almost like a giant scorecard they were keeping, like constantly updating.
Exactly, like a multi-dimensional chessboard.
Wow.
And they believed that after World War II, the advantage was steadily shifting in their favor.
Interesting. So they weren't just counting tanks and planes. They were factoring in like morale, economic output, all these other things.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
I mean, did they have like specific ways to measure these more abstract factors?
That's a great question. While they definitely emphasized quantitative analysis,
Right.
there was a degree of subjectivity to it. So
Sure.
they developed these detailed assessments of their own strengths and weaknesses,
Okay.
as well as their adversaries, taking into account things like industrial capacity, technological advancements, even the perceived resolve of their populations.
So it's a blend of like hard data, but also like educated guesswork.
Exactly.
It makes you wonder how accurate those assessments really were,
Right.
especially when you're dealing with these, less tangible factors.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the one of the ongoing debates among historians.
Right.
But what's clear is that, they really believed in this holistic approach
Okay.
to gauging power, and it informed their decision making at the highest levels.
Okay, so they've got this like really broad view of how they assess, the global balance of power.
Yeah.
But did they have like, specific rules of war
They did.
or like, codes of conduct to guide their military actions?
They did, but not in the legal or humanitarian sense that we might think of today.
Right, right.
They had what they called laws of war, which were essentially guiding principles for how they believed conflict would play out.
Okay.
One striking example is their conviction that the initial balance of forces, largely predetermine the outcome of a war.
So getting that early advantage was paramount.
Absolutely. They put a huge emphasis on being prepared to strike first. And decisively believing that a strong initial offensive could disrupt the enemy's plans and set the stage for victory.
Yeah, makes sense given their whole always at war mentality.
Right.
But didn't they also place a lot of value on surprise and deception?
He did.
Like, how do those two things go together?
That's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
You have this seeming contradiction between their calculated assessments of power, right?
Right.
And their reliance on surprise and maneuverability. They firmly believed in the offensive as the primary form of combat.
Okay.
But they also understood the importance of catching the enemy off guard and exploiting vulnerabilities.
So it's like calculated aggression, but also tactical cunning.
Exactly.
Can you give us like a concrete example of how this duality played out on the battlefield?
Sure. One of their defining tactics was the attack in depth.
Okay.
Imagine this. Instead of just hitting the front lines, right?
Uh-huh.
They launched these simultaneous strikes, throughout the enemy's defenses,
Mhm.
aiming to disrupt their command and control, and ultimately shatter their ability to resist.
So it's more than just like a head-on assault.
Yeah, much more.
We're trying to create chaos.
Yeah, like a controlled chaos
Okay.
to paralyze the enemy.
How do they actually, like, practically achieve that, that coordinated disruption?
So it involved this carefully orchestrated combination of artillery barrages, airstrikes, and then rapid advances by their ground forces.
Okay.
Imagine like entire enemy formations being targeted,
Huh.
not just at the front, but also from behind and the flanks.
Yeah, that's got to be incredibly disorienting
Oh, absolutely.
for the defending forces.
Yeah, attacks coming from every direction.
Did they have, like, specialized units for this kind of, like, multi-pronged attack?
They did,
Okay.
and they gave it a rather dramatic name, the Operational Maneuver Group, or OMG.
OMG indeed. That name certainly gets your attention.
Right.
So what made this group so special?
So the OMG, it was a highly mobile and self-sufficient force tailored for deep penetration behind enemy lines.
Okay.
They were trained to exploit breakthroughs
Right.
that were created by that initial attack,
Uh-huh.
to wreak havoc on critical infrastructure, logistics, and just sow chaos before the main Soviet force even arrived.
Oh, they're like elite raiders.
Exactly, operating with a high degree of autonomy,
Okay.
designed to maximize disruption.
So they create the chaos, then they send in this special group to really exploit it.
That's the idea.
Okay. Starting to get a sense of how this military machine really worked. But how did firepower fit into all of this?
Uh-huh.
What was their approach to things like artillery and air support?
So fire superiority was absolutely paramount to the Soviets. They believed in overwhelming the enemy with sheer volume of firepower.
Okay.
And their doctrine had, very specific norms for ammunition expenditure.
Right.
They developed these intricate fire plans that coordinated artillery, airstrikes, ground-based rocket system to just saturate target areas.
Wow.
They even had this concept called fire sacks.
Fire sacks.
Imagine these pre-planned zones of concentrated fire.
Okay.
Where they just aimed to completely obliterate
Wow.
any enemy forces caught within them.
So it wasn't just random shelling. They were very calculating.
Oh, very much so.
It really speaks to their emphasis on overwhelming force.
Absolutely.
But was it all about brute force?
Uh-huh.
Or did they also employ more, subtle tactics?
They were also keenly aware of the importance of electronic warfare,
Okay.
both for gathering intelligence
Mm.
and disrupting enemy communication and radar systems.
Mm.
They had dedicated electronic warfare units at various levels,
Okay.
and they even employed techniques like radio intrusion
Okay.
to spread misinformation
Wow.
and sow confusion among enemy forces.
Mm.
So it was really a multi-layered approach to conflict. Yeah.
It wasn't just about tanks and bombs. It was about controlling the information battle space.
Exactly.
This is adding like a whole other dimension to our understanding of their military thinking. But, what about the darker side of warfare?
Mm.
How did their doctrine address, like, the potential use of nuclear and chemical weapons?
So while they acknowledge the potential devastation
Right.
of these weapons, their doctrine included detailed planning for both nuclear and chemical strikes,
Okay.
with pre-designated targets
Right.
and clear chains of command for authorization.
Mhm.
They weren't afraid to consider these options,
All right.
even though they understood the immense risks involved.
It's a chilling reminder of how high the stakes were during the Cold War.
Yeah.
And it makes you appreciate, the delicate balance that prevented these weapons from ever being used.
For sure.
But before we get too far ahead of ourselves,
Sure.
let's rewind a bit. I'm curious about their command structure. Like how did they organize their forces?
Okay.
And who was ultimately calling the shots?
So at the very top, you had the National Military Command Authority,
Okay.
which was this, this triumvirate of power.
Yeah.
It consisted of the Council of Defense, the main military council, and the General Staff.
So it sounds like a rather top-heavy structure.
Yeah.
And where did the Communist Party fit into all of this? Like, how much influence did they have on the military?
The Communist Party's influence was absolute.
Okay.
The Council of Defense, which was chaired by the General Secretary himself,
Right.
held the ultimate authority. This meant that the party, they dictated military economic planning
Wow.
and even determined the peacetime structure of the armed forces.
So the party was really calling the shots.
Yeah.
But how did that, centralized control actually play out, on the battlefield? Like,
Yeah.
how did orders flow from the top down to the troops on the ground?
So in wartime, they organized their forces into these things called theaters of military operations, or TVDs,
Okay.
essentially massive geographic areas of operation.
Got it.
Within each TVD, they would form what they called fronts, which were essentially army groups
Sure.
responsible for carrying out specific objectives.
So these fronts were like the operational workhorses of the Soviet military.
Exactly.
And who was calling the shots at that level?
So the general staff, working closely with the top party leadership,
Uh-huh.
exercised direct control over these front commanders.
Okay.
They really believed in this tight control from the top down,
Okay.
with each level of command being responsible for executing orders and reporting back up the chain.
That sounds like it could create some bottlenecks,
Yeah,
especially in like a rapidly changing battlefield situation.
right.
Was there any room for flexibility or independent decision making among those lower level commanders?
So while they favored that centralized control,
Right.
they also recognized the need for commanders to act on their own initiative
Okay.
in certain situations. Their doctrine emphasized the importance of initiative as a key principle of warfare,
Okay.
encouraging commanders to seize opportunities, exploit enemy weaknesses, and adapt to unexpected developments.
So it's kind of like a balancing act between, top-down control and battlefield flexibility.
Exactly. They understood that modern warfare
Right.
is fluid and unpredictable,
Yeah.
and they tried to build in mechanisms that allowed for both centralized planning and decentralized execution.
Okay.
Yeah.
Makes sense. So we've got the big picture, we've got how they structure their command.
Right.
But, shifting gears a bit.
Sure.
Let's talk about the human element.
Okay.
How did they train
Yeah.
and motivate their troops to operate within this, really demanding system?
So indoctrination and political loyalty were absolutely paramount. They had political officers embedded at every level,
Wow.
all the way down to the company level.
Okay.
These officers were responsible for maintaining troop morale,
Uh,
reinforcing ideological commitment, and ensuring adherence to the party line.
so a constant reminder of the ideological mission,
Yes.
even in the heat of battle.
Absolutely.
Did that focus on ideology translate to their combat training as well?
So their training
Yeah.
was incredibly rigorous, with a heavy emphasis on, drills,
Right.
repetition, and standardization. They instilled specific tactics and norms for everything,
Oh.
from troop movements to fire support, aiming to create a predictable and efficient fighting force.
That sounds very different from the Western emphasis on individual initiative and adaptability.
It is.
Were there any downsides to this kind of rigid approach to training?
Well, while it did create a highly disciplined and coordinated force, it also potentially limited creativity and flexibility on the battlefield.
Right.
Their soldiers were well trained in their specific roles,
Okay.
but they might have struggled to improvise or adapt to unexpected situations.
So it's kind of a double-edged sword there.
Exactly.
So, we've been talking a lot about the strengths of this Soviet military machine.
Right.
But every system has its weaknesses.
Of course.
What were some of the vulnerabilities that Western strategists might have tried to exploit?
So one recurring problem for the Soviets
Yeah.
was logistics.
Okay.
Maintaining those supply lines
Right.
for such a massive military, especially across these vast distances
Yeah.
and often challenging terrain, was a constant struggle.
Okay.
Their reliance on railroads and truck convoys
Right.
made them susceptible to disruption and interdiction.
So kind of like a glass cannon.
Yeah.
Powerful but potentially fragile.
To a certain extent, yeah. Their offensive power was formidable. Right. But their ability to sustain it over time,
Okay.
especially in a prolonged conflict, that was a significant vulnerability.
Yeah, that makes sense. Especially given their focus on, rapid advances and deep strikes.
Mm-hmm.
Were there any other weaknesses that stand out?
Well, their rigid command structure,
Right.
while effective in some contexts,
Sure.
It could also be a liability. The emphasis on centralized control
Right.
and strict adherence to plans could make them slow to adapt
Okay.
to unexpected developments
Yeah.
or exploit fleeting opportunities on the battlefield.
It's fascinating to think about how those, those strengths and weaknesses might have actually played out in a real conflict.
Yeah.
But we've covered like a lot of ground here,
Yeah, we have.
from their like overarching doctrine to their battlefield tactics.
Yeah.
But what about the less conventional aspects of their military strategy? I'm thinking of things like special forces, unconventional warfare, operations that happen outside the traditional battlefield.
So they had a deep appreciation
Okay.
for those methods.
Okay.
They maintained dedicated special forces units
Uh-huh.
tasked with reconnaissance, sabotage, and disruption
Okay.
behind enemy lines. They also they integrated unconventional warfare into their broader strategy,
Oh,
supporting partisan movements
right.
in enemy territory, spreading disinformation,
Right.
even using covert agents
Right.
to influence political events.
So they weren't afraid to operate in the shadows,
Not at all.
leveraging these, less conventional tactics.
Yeah, they saw these methods as as force multipliers, I guess,
Right.
allowing them to exert influence and disrupt their adversaries in ways that went beyond traditional military confrontation.
Right.
It was all part of, their broader strategy of achieving their objectives by any means necessary.
So they were really playing a multi-dimensional game here.
Yes.
Combining that, brute force with cunning and subterfuge.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah.
Okay. But amidst all this talk of strategy and tactics,
Yeah.
one key element keeps coming back to me.
Okay.
Combined arms operations.
Yes.
Can you elaborate a bit on why that concept was so central to their thinking?
Yeah, so combined arms operations,
Yeah.
the seamless integration and coordination of different branches of the military.
Right. Right.
Infantry, armor, artillery, air power. This was considered absolutely essential for achieving victory.
Okay.
They believed in achieving this synergistic effect
Uh-huh.
where, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts.
So not just relying on one type of force, but like orchestrating a symphony of destruction, I guess.
A very fitting analogy.
Okay.
Yeah, they meticulously planned and rehearsed these combined arms operations from small unit tactics all the way up to, large-scale offensives.
Wow.
They believed that this coordinated approach
Yeah.
was crucial for overwhelming the enemy and breaking their will to resist.
It's a testament to their focus on, both detailed planning, but also, we talked about the flexibility on the battlefield as well.
Yeah.
But, with all this emphasis on military might, were there any areas where they lagged behind,
Yes.
technologically speaking?
One area where they consistently trailed the West was in computing and information technology.
Interesting.
While they recognized the importance of electronics and automation,
Sure.
they struggled to keep pace with Western advancements in these fields.
That's interesting, especially considering like their emphasis on centralized control.
Yeah.
You would think that they would be all over the latest technology.
Hey, wouldn't you?
Yeah, to enhance their command and control
Well,
capabilities.
they certainly tried, but their system, it was inherently less adaptable
Okay.
to rapid technological change. The bureaucratic nature of their economy, combined with limitations in their industrial base,
Yeah.
it hindered their ability to innovate and rapidly adopt new technologies.
So less cutting edge computers,
Yeah.
but more emphasis on, brute force and sheer numbers.
I mean, that's a simplification, but it captures a key aspect
Okay.
of their approach. Yeah, they compensated for, technological shortcomings
Right.
with overwhelming firepower and manpower, relying on tried and true methods that they had mastered
Right.
over decades.
Okay, so we're starting to get a sense of how they approach technology, where they excelled, where they lagged behind.
Mm-hmm.
But it raises the question of, how did their military doctrine influence their broader foreign policy and their actions, on the world stage?
Sure.
Were they content to just, defend their borders?
Uh-huh.
Or did they have like, more ambitious goals in mind?
Their Their military doctrine, it was inherently expansionist,
Okay.
driven by this belief in the inevitable triumph of communism.
Okay.
They saw themselves as the vanguard of, a global revolution,
Right.
and believed in actively promoting its spread
Wow.
around the world.
So the military wasn't just, a tool for defense.
Sure.
It was an instrument of ideology.
Precisely. It was inextricably linked
Okay.
to their foreign policy goals
Got it.
and their vision of a communist world order. Their military buildup,
Uh-huh.
their support for communist movements around the world,
Right.
interventions in places like Hungary and Czechoslovakia.
Right.
All of it stemmed from this underlying belief
Wow.
in the need to advance their ideological agenda.
It's a sobering reminder that military power is never just about, weapons and tactics.
No.
It's about ideas and beliefs that drive those actions.
Absolutely.
And that's something that's really important to keep in mind as we try to make sense of this period. So this deep dive has it's been incredibly eye-opening.
Yeah, it has.
It's given me, a much deeper understanding of the forces at play,
Mm-hmm.
During that era,
Uh-huh.
the mindset of the Soviet leadership,
Right.
the challenges they faced.
Yeah.
But I'm still curious about one thing.
Okay.
Logistics.
Okay.
We touched on it earlier, as a potential weakness.
Right.
But I'd love to dig a little deeper.
Sure.
Like how did they actually manage to supply this massive military machine,
Uh-huh.
especially given those technological limitations?
Yeah. It was a Herculean effort, often plagued with challenges. They relied heavily on their vast network of railroads to move troops and heavy equipment over those long distances.
So that classic image of endless trains
Yeah.
rolling across the Siberian steppes, carrying tanks and soldiers, that sort of thing.
Exactly. But while railroads provided that backbone, of their logistical system,
Uh-huh.
they also relied on a vast network of truck convoys
Okay.
to move supplies from railheads to frontline units.
So it's like a two-pronged approach.
Yeah.
Railroads for the heavy lifting.
Yeah.
And then the trucks for kind of like the last mile.
Exactly. But both systems, face significant challenges.
Yep.
Their railroads, while extensive, they were often outdated
Right.
and inefficient, and their truck convoys were frequently hampered by, poor road infrastructure
Yeah.
and harsh weather conditions.
Not exactly a recipe for smooth operations.
No, not really. Maintaining that flow of supplies, especially during large-scale operations, that was a constant headache for Soviet logisticians.
Yeah.
They had to improvise,
Right.
adapt, and often make do with less than ideal conditions.
It makes you wonder how they would have fared, in a prolonged conflict.
Right.
Especially against a technologically superior opponent
Yeah.
with more advanced logistical capabilities.
That's a question that military analysts have debated for decades.
Right.
It really highlights one of the key uncertainties surrounding the Soviet military machine,
Yeah.
their ability to sustain itself over time
Okay.
in a high-intensity conflict.
The sobering thought.
Yeah.
But it also underscores, the importance of logistics as a key element of military power.
Absolutely.
We've explored the challenges
Uh-huh.
of keeping those armies supplied.
Right.
But what about the training that prepared those soldiers,
Yes.
for combat?
Okay.
We briefly touched on their emphasis on drills and standardization.
Right.
But I'm curious about the specifics.
Uh-huh.
What did their training actually look like?
It was incredibly demanding.
Okay.
Designed to harden those soldiers both physically and mentally.
Okay.
They pushed those troops to their limits, often conducting training in harsh conditions
Right.
that closely simulated the realities of the battlefield.
So no cushy boot camps.
No, definitely not.
For Soviet recruits, their training emphasized endurance,
Yes.
resilience,
Yeah,
the ability to operate, even under extreme stress.
exactly. They wanted their soldiers to be prepared
Right.
for the worst that the battlefield could throw at them.
Makes sense.
Mhm.
Given their doctrine of, fighting on enemy territory, did they focus primarily on individual skills, or did they also emphasize, teamwork and and unit cohesion?
Both.
Okay.
Both were essential elements of their training.
Okay.
Yeah, it's fascinating um, how ideology kind of permeated even the operational details,
Right.
of their military. It makes you wonder, how they reconciled those grand ambitions with the practical realities
Yeah,
of
right.
warfare, especially given, what we were talking about,
Yeah.
their logistical challenges.
Yeah, yeah. Let's dig a little deeper into those logistical issues.
Okay.
We touched on their reliance on railroads and trucks, but
Uh-huh.
what about like the sheer scale of resources they needed to move?
Yeah.
How did they manage that?
Well,
Especially given the technological constraints we talked about earlier.
imagine the logistical puzzle
Yeah.
of moving and supplying, millions of soldiers,
Right.
thousands of tanks, and countless tons of ammunition and
Mm.
other supplies.
Yeah.
It was a monumental task,
Right.
and they relied on a system that was both vast and surprisingly low tech.
So not exactly a model of efficiency.
Not by modern standards, no.
Okay.
While they had a fairly extensive rail network,
Mm.
much of it was outdated and
Right.
and struggled to handle the sheer volume of traffic
Yeah.
required during large scale operations.
Okay.
They often faced, bottlenecks, delays, breakdowns, which could severely impact their ability to,
Yeah.
to keep their forces supplied.
It sounds like a logistical nightmare.
It certainly posed significant challenges. To compensate, they relied heavily on manpower.
Okay.
Think of, massive human chains
Okay.
unloading supplies from trains,
Mhm.
platoons of soldiers repairing damaged tracks, and endless columns of trucks bumping along, rough roads.
So a lot of sweat and muscle went
Yeah.
into keeping this military machine running.
Absolutely. Human effort was a key element of
Okay.
their logistical system, and it often made the difference between, success and failure
Right.
on the battlefield.
It really highlights the human cost
Yeah.
of their military ambitions,
Yeah.
not just in terms of combat casualties,
Right.
but also the sheer physical labor
Yeah,
required to support those operations.
for sure.
We've talked about the challenges, but were there any at spots in their logistical system? Any innovations or areas where they excelled?
They were remarkably adept at improvisation
Yep.
and adaptation. Their logistical troops were trained to make do with limited resources,
Right.
to repair and maintain equipment under difficult conditions, and to find creative solutions,
Right.
to unexpected problems.
So a bit of that classic Russian ingenuity
Exactly.
coming into play.
Yeah, they were masters of
Yeah.
making the most of what they had, and their ability to improvise often proved crucial, in keeping their forces supplied,
That-
even in the face of significant challenges.
It seems they had a knack for turning adversity
Yeah.
into an advantage. But even the most resourceful, logistics system
Right.
can only go so far
Uh-huh.
without well-trained and motivated soldiers
Right.
to operate it.
Of course.
We discussed their rigorous training regimen,
Yeah.
but I'm curious about the psychological aspects
Okay.
of their approach.
Sure. Yeah.
How did they instill, discipline, loyalty, and that almost fanatical commitment
Uh-huh.
to their cause?
It went beyond,
Yeah.
simple obedience to orders.
Right.
They embedded political indoctrination into
Yeah.
every aspect of military life,
Okay.
aiming to create soldiers who were not only, skilled fighters.
But also true believers
Okay.
in the communist ideology.
So it was as much about shaping hearts and minds
Yeah.
as it was about, physical training.
Exactly. Political officers
Okay.
played a crucial role in this process.
Okay.
They were present at every level
Huh.
of the military hierarchy,
Right.
conducting regular political lectures,
Right.
organizing discussions about current events,
Uh-huh.
and monitoring the morale and ideological purity
Wow.
of the troops.
It sounds like a very, very intense and
Yeah.
pervasive system of control.
It was what?
Did it actually work? Did it truly instill, that level of commitment and belief?
It's difficult to gauge the effectiveness
Right.
of indoctrination with absolute certainty.
Sure.
However, there's ample evidence that it did have a profound impact
Yeah.
on the mindset
Okay.
and behavior of Soviet soldiers.
Many fought with
Mhm.
incredible bravery and determination, convinced that they were fighting for a just cause, even when faced with, overwhelming odds.
It speaks to the power of belief,
Yeah.
even in the face of hardship and danger.
Right.
But did this focus on, ideological purity
Mhm.
also have downsides?
Uh,
Did it stifle critical thinking or create like, blind obedience?
that's a valid question.
Okay.
While indoctrination undoubtedly fostered loyalty and commitment,
Right.
it also likely discouraged dissent,
Oh,
critical thinking, and independent action.
yeah.
The emphasis on conformity and adherence to the party line
Right.
could potentially stifle creativity and innovation, especially in rapidly changing battlefield situations.
So another example of that double-edged sword we discussed earlier.
Exactly. Their system was designed to produce soldiers who were unquestioningly loyal
Right.
and obedient, but it also potentially limited their ability to adapt,
Okay.
to improvise,
Right.
and respond effectively to unexpected challenges.
This deep dive has provided like a fascinating glimpse
Yeah.
into the inner workings of this Soviet military machine.
It is interesting.
We've explored their strengths, their weaknesses, their tactics, their logistics,
Mm-hmm.
even their psychological approach to warfare.
Right.
But I'm curious, like how did all of this translate
Okay.
into actual military
Yeah.
capabilities? What were some of the specific weapon systems or technological innovations that they fielded,
Mm-hmm.
and how did they compare to their Western counterparts?
In terms of conventional weaponry,
Yeah.
they placed a heavy emphasis on quantity
Okay.
over quality. They produced vast numbers of tanks,
Right.
artillery pieces, aircraft, and other military hardware,
Okay.
often prioritizing simplicity, ruggedness, and ease of production over cutting edge technology.
So a brute force approach
Uh,
to military production.
To a certain extent, yes.
Okay.
They understood that, in a large-scale conflict, sheer numbers could be a decisive factor, especially given their vast reserves of manpower.
Okay.
They aimed to overwhelm their opponents with just a flood
Oh,
of
yeah.
tanks, artillery shells, infantry, even if
Yeah.
those individual systems were not always, technologically superior.
It's a reminder that military power isn't just about having the most advanced weapons.
Mhm.
It's also about having enough of them
Right.
to make a difference on the battlefield. But didn't they also have some notable achievements in certain technological areas?
They certainly did.
They made significant strides in rocketry and missile technology,
Right.
developing powerful intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs,
Right.
that posed a direct threat to the United States.
Okay.
They also fielded sophisticated air defense systems,
Right.
including surface-to-air missiles or SAMs, and advanced radar systems designed to protect their airspace,
Yeah.
from enemy attack.
So it's a mix of brute force and technological sophistication.
Exactly.
It highlights, the strategic choices they made, focusing their technological efforts on areas they deemed essential for, their national security and their global ambitions. But despite these achievements, we've also discussed, their shortcomings, areas like computing and information technology.
Yeah.
How did those limitations affect their military capabilities? Well, their lag in computing and information technology had significant implications for their command and control systems,
Yes.
their ability to gather and process intelligence,
Okay.
and their overall battlefield awareness. While they recognize the importance of these technologies,
Right.
their centralized and often bureaucratic system
Sure.
struggled to keep pace with the rapid advancements happening in the West.
So while they excelled in certain areas
Yeah.
of military technology, they were playing catch up in others,
Right.
potentially creating vulnerabilities that
Yeah.
that their adversaries could could exploit.
Exactly. Their technological strengths and weaknesses
Right.
reflected their broader strengths and weaknesses
Oh,
as a
yeah.
society.
Wow.
They were capable of incredible feats of, engineering
Sure.
and scientific innovation, but their system often struggled to translate those achievements
Right.
into widespread adoption and practical application.
It's a fascinating insight into the interconnectedness of military power,
It is.
technological progress,
Yeah,
and societal structures.
absolutely.
We've delved into their hardware, their software, their tactics,
Uh-huh.
and their ideology.
Yeah.
It's clear that they were a formidable force,
They were.
but one with its own, internal contradictions
Right.
and vulnerabilities.
For sure.
But before we wrap up this
Okay,
this
sure.
part of our deep dive, I wanted to circle back to something you mentioned earlier.
Okay.
Their belief in the inevitability
Right.
of conflict with the capitalist world.
Uh-huh.
How did this ideological conviction,
Yeah.
shape their strategic planning
Sure.
and their overall approach to warfare?
It had a profound impact on every aspect of their military thinking.
Oh, yeah.
They believed that war with the West was not a question of, if but when.
Right.
And they prepared accordingly.
Right.
Their entire military machine, from their weapon systems to their training doctrines to their logistical networks, it was all designed
Right.
to fight and win that inevitable clash.
So they weren't just preparing for, any war.
Right.
They were preparing for a specific kind of war,
Exactly.
a showdown with the capitalist world.
Yeah, a clash of ideologies.
Uh-huh.
They studied Western military capabilities,
Right.
analyzed NATO's strategic doctrines,
Mhm.
and war gamed various scenarios
to
to anticipate how such a conflict might unfold.
Right.
Their belief in the inevitability of this confrontation
Yeah.
drove their military planning and shaped their perception of the world.
It's a sobering thought, but it also underscores, the importance of understanding the ideological underpinnings
Yeah.
of their military thinking.
Right.
It wasn't just about, territorial ambitions or power politics. It was about a fundamental clash of worldviews.
Exactly. To truly grasp,
Right.
the Soviet military machine,
Yeah.
you have to understand the ideological engine that drove it.
Okay.
It wasn't, simply a tool of state power.
Right.
It was an instrument of their belief system,
Right.
and an extension of their worldview.
Okay. This deep dive has been incredibly illuminating.
It does.
It's given us, a much richer understanding of not just their
Right.
their military capabilities,
Right.
but also the ideological framework that
Right.
that shaped their actions.
Yeah.
But before we move on, I'd like to touch on one more area
Sure.
that's crucial to understanding their military posture, their nuclear strategy.
Sure.
We've talked about their willingness
Mhm.
to consider, nuclear weapons,
Right.
but how did those weapons
Mhm.
fit into their overall strategic thinking?
Sure.
Did they see them as, a last resort, a deterrent, or something else entirely?
That's a complex question.
Okay.
And their thinking on nuclear weapons evolved over time. Initially, they saw them primarily as a deterrent,
Okay.
a way to to counter the perceived American nuclear advantage,
Right.
and prevent a nuclear attack on
Right.
Soviet soil.
Okay.
But as their nuclear arsenal grew,
Right.
their thinking became more nuanced.
So it wasn't just about, preventing a nuclear attack
Yeah.
on themselves. It also became about projecting power and influence.
Exactly. They began to incorporate nuclear weapons.
into their warfighting doctrines,
Right.
exploring their potential use in various scenarios.
Okay.
Not just as a last resort, but as a potential tool
Okay.
to achieve their military objectives.
That's a chilling thought.
Yeah.
Did they develop specific plans
Yes, they did.
for how they might, use nuclear weapons in a conflict?
Their military planners
Yeah.
developed detailed plans
Okay.
for both strategic nuclear strikes,
Okay.
targeting, major cities
Right.
and military installations,
Yeah.
and tactical nuclear strikes, use smaller nuclear weapons on the battlefield
Right.
to disrupt, enemy formations and,
Right.
and achieve breakthroughs.
So they weren't afraid to consider the use of nuclear weapons,
It seems not.
even in a limited capacity.
While they understood the,
Right. Yeah.
devastating consequences
Yeah.
of a full-blown nuclear war,
Right.
they were willing to explore
Okay, right.
the possibility of using nuclear weapons
Sure.
in a more controlled manner
Right.
to achieve their military objectives.
Wow.
It was a risky and controversial strategy,
Yeah.
and one that caused,
Right.
great concern in the West.
It highlights the dangerous logic of nuclear deterrence,
Uh-huh.
and the precarious balance of power
Right.
that existed during the Cold War.
Mhm.
It's a stark reminder
It is.
of how close the world came
Yeah.
to the brink of nuclear annihilation.
Yeah.
But before we get too lost in the existential dread
Sure.
of nuclear warfare, I think it's time to move on to the next part of
Yeah.
our deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground here,
We have.
but there's still much to explore.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it really is a sobering thought, just
Yeah.
how close humanity came to catastrophe during that era.
Absolutely.
But let's
Yeah.
let's shift gears for a moment and consider a hypothetical scenario here.
Okay.
What if that war with the West had actually happened?
Right.
How might things have unfolded?
Yeah.
Given what we've learned about, their doctrine and capabilities.
That's a question that's both like fascinating and terrifying to contemplate. Given their emphasis on a rapid and decisive offensive, I imagine the initial stages of the conflict would have been incredibly intense.
Imagine a massive combined arms offensive,
Right.
spearheaded by thousands of tanks, supported by overwhelming artillery fire and airstrikes, surging across the plains of Europe. Their goal would have been to overwhelm NATO defenses,
Right.
seize key territory,
and shatter the Western alliance's, will to fight before it could fully mobilize.
So like a blitzkrieg
Yeah.
on a massive scale,
Mm-hmm.
aiming to achieve like a decisive victory
Right.
in the opening stages of the war. But what if
Yeah.
NATO had managed to hold the line?
Right.
To prevent that initial breakthrough.
Right.
How would the Soviets have adapted?
That's where their doctrine gets a bit murky.
Okay.
While they excelled at offensive operations,
Right.
they were less prepared for a prolonged, attritional war. Their logistical vulnerabilities, their reliance on standardized tactics,
Right.
and their centralized command structure. All of those things could have become liabilities.
Okay.
In a protracted conflict.
So a case of their strengths becoming weaknesses
Mm-hmm.
if the initial gamble didn't pay off. Exactly. They might have struggled to adapt to a more, fluid and unpredictable battlefield.
Yeah.
One where initiative and flexibility were paramount.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about like how those inherent tensions within their doctrine,
Right.
the emphasis on both rapid offense, but also the potential for prolonged war, how those things might have actually played out in a real conflict.
Yeah, that's the big question.
But let's step back from those
Right.
hypothetical battlefields for a moment.
Okay.
This deep dive has focused primarily on the Soviet military machine itself, but we can't forget the human element.
Of course not.
What can you tell us about the lives and experiences of the ordinary soldiers who served in this massive military apparatus?
It's easy to get caught up. Yeah.
In the grand strategies and abstract theories of warfare,
Yeah.
but ultimately it's individual human beings who fight and die on those battlefields.
Of course.
The Soviet soldier was in many ways a product of that system.
Okay.
Disciplined, resilient,
Right.
and often often fatalistic. They were drawn from, all corners of
Right.
that vast Soviet empire,
Yeah.
representing a wide range of ethnicities, cultures,
Right.
and backgrounds.
So a microcosm of Soviet society itself?
Precisely. Their experiences
Right.
varied widely depending on,
Sure.
their roles, their units,
Right.
and where they were deployed.
Uh-huh.
Some saw, intense combat,
Right.
enduring unimaginable hardship,
Yeah.
and witnessing, unspeakable horrors.
Yeah.
Others served in support roles, far from
Yeah.
the front lines, but still,
Facing the challenges of military life.
of
Or
course,
separation from loved ones, and
Right.
and the ever-present weight of ideological indoctrination.
It's a reminder that behind those vast armies
Mhm.
and complex doctrines, there were millions
Yeah.
of individual stories,
Absolutely.
each with its own complexities
Right.
and nuances.
Mhm.
And speaking of individual stories, I'm curious about the role of leadership
Yeah.
in the Soviet military. We talked about the centralized command structure,
Mhm.
but what about the individuals who occupied those positions of power? What kind of leaders
Right.
did the Soviet system produce?
Well, they ranged from, brilliant strategists
Yeah.
and charismatic commanders to rigid bureaucrats
Mhm.
and ruthless political operatives.
Wow.
The Soviet system was in many ways a meritocracy,
Okay.
but it was also heavily influenced by political considerations.
Okay.
Rising through the ranks often required not just, military competence, but
Mhm.
also ideological purity
Right.
and unwavering loyalty
Okay.
to the party.
So a combination of skill, cunning, and political savvy.
Exactly. And those who rose to the top
Yeah.
often embodied those qualities.
Awesome.
Some were, true believers in the communist ideology,
Right.
driven by a desire to, to spread their vision of
Uh-huh.
a better world. Others were more pragmatic,
Right.
motivated by ambition,
Right.
power, or a combination of both.
It's fascinating to think about, those individuals, the pressures they faced, the
Yeah.
choices they made,
Yeah.
and the impact they had
Yeah.
on the course of history. And I suppose that's true of history in general. It's
Yeah.
ultimately a story of individuals, their actions, their motivations,
Mhm.
and the unintended consequences that ripple outward.
Couldn't agree more. And as we wrap up this deep dive into Soviet military doctrine,
Right.
I think it's important to remember that history is not just a collection
Yeah.
of facts and dates.
Of course.
It's a tapestry woven from the lives and experiences
Yeah.
of countless individuals.
It's a reminder that even the most abstract and theoretical concepts
Mhm.
have real world implications,
Right.
affecting the lives
Wow.
of people in profound and often unpredictable ways.
Absolutely.
And ultimately,
Yeah.
it's those human stories
Right.
that make history so compelling and relevant to our own lives.
Well said. And on that note,
Yeah.
we'll leave you to ponder the complexities of military doctrine,
Yeah.
the weight of history, and the enduring power
of the human spirit.
This has been a fascinating journey
It
through Soviet military thinking.
Uh-huh.
I've learned a lot,
I have too.
and I'm sure our listeners have as well. Thank you for joining us
It's my pleasure.
on this deep dive